Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shaukatali.
And a very good evening to you and a warm welcome to Newsline Live. And today we have a guest and we have a very specific question for our guest, and we are rather confident that he can provide us the answers. And that really is because we've had time and time again, there's a mega argument going on in across all sort of sectors, and that is to do with what is the true debt position of our country. True debt, the real debt, not some sort of numbers that are later changed, or they're couched, or people actually don't know and they come on the media and try and sort of say things and try and get away with it. But that's simply not good enough. We want to know the truth, and we want to know it the way it really is, so that we can all fully appreciate the absolute conundrum that our country is faced with. And that of course is, what is Sri Lanka's total debt position? To answer that and a little bit more is of course the Chief Operating Officer of Advocata, no stranger to our program, Mr. Dhananath Fernando. Thank you very much, Dhananath, for being on the program again.
Thank you for having me.
It's really, I'm looking for the truth, the real truth. I'd like to know, no holds barred, okay, what is Sri Lanka's total public debt position? 2005, 2010, 2020, but what is the total?
For us, the total as at 2021 end of June, first half, is 17 trillion.
17 trillion.
17
Explain trillion to our public.
Yes, so trillion is 1,000 billions, but let me give a understandable, comprehensible example. Now, I saw Sri Lanka has started a new program, Million Drop.
Yes, the money drop.
Money drop. So that's total value is 5 million, that they ask questions and people can answer and take home that 5 million. If you invite a representative from each household in Sri Lanka, which is about 5 million households.
So in Sri Lanka we've got 5 million households.
5 million, about 5 million households. So one representative from your family, my family.
From each household, one person. From each house,
every weaver will have a representative from their family.
Okay.
If you invite them to Stein Studio,
yeah,
and if you, without dropping any money, you can give them about 3.6 million without asking any question from this debt.
And that would 3.6 times 5,000 households, 5 million households, so 5 million people.
Absolutely.
And then you get an idea.
Yes, you get an idea
of how much 17
trillion is about.
Okay.
If I were to simplify further, imagine if we invite every Sri Lankan citizen, about 21 million, 22 million people to Stein Studio. Everyone can take home about 720,000 rupees is the equivalent of this 17 trillion debt.
7 laksha visidai.
7 laksha visidai. But there are two limitations for us. One is this 2021 first half. Now the debt, there are two parts of the debt. No, some government has borrowed from rupees. They have gone to the markets and asked, okay, give me Sri Lankan rupees.
So that would be treasury bills and bonds.
Absolutely. And then they also have borrowed in dollars.
Yes.
So 70
ISBs,
exactly, ISBs from some governments, some multilaterals. So 17 trillion is the rupee value. So the rupee value changes based on the exchange rate.
Yes. So this 17 trillion is calculated at what exchange rate?
It's about 202 rupees, which is the 2021 first half.
My goodness. So it's nearly double this.
Absolutely. And then we borrowed money which is not, we don't have any public records, because if you recall, at like overnight we borrowed about 1.5 billion US dollars from India, a swap facility from China, another swap from Bangladesh, some from World Bank. So those data is, I mean, it's like just there's a news report, but absolute value is difficult to find. But I can confidently say in 2021 first half it was about it was about 17 trillion at
Right.
that exchange rate.
Right.
So my view is it's definitely more than that, but I have to only go with Faraz with the available public data. So that's the amount.
So really, it's not 17 trillion.
Yes, it has.
more-
There's a limitation for that calculation because of the availability of the sources.
Right. So it's much more than that.
It's much more than that.
Right. But it's at least 17 trillion.
Yes.
Trillion. Ladies and gentlemen, 17 trillion. A trillion has got 12 zeros. 12 zeros. So it's 17, 3 zeros, comma, 3 zeros, comma, 3 zeros, comma, and 3 zeros. So this is the sad position.
Yes.
How sustainable is this? How on earth are we going to service it? Is this why the IMF are having a bit of a tough time in considering assisting Sri Lanka?
Absolutely. So this is too much debt, and our debt is also not only too much, it's very expensive. That means we have borrowed money at very, very high interest rates. And the composition is also very complicated, because we have, as you very correctly said, we have borrowed a lot from the markets by issuing sovereign bonds. They are, it's in short maturity, very high interest rates like 6%, 7%, very high.
And it also didn't help, did it, Dhananath, that back in 2015, February the 26th or thereabouts, the central bank, when the going rate was approximately 9.85%, borrowed 10 billion rupees at 12.505, which is like a lot more than the going rate was. And of course, that is now popularly known as the alleged bond scam. It didn't help, did it?
Absolutely, Faraz. So this borrowing from sovereign bonds is, it's easy money. Easy money in the sense you can go to the markets and raise money.
Yeah.
But if it's a bilateral, if you're lending on a bilateral basis or for a multilateral basis, it's a very complicated process, because you have to do a feasibility study, you have to show how are you going to pay that debt.
So this other bit is the easier way of borrowing money, but generally speaking, the easier it is, the higher the rate.
Absolutely. And the sad story is, for us, we borrowed more money to pay the interest of the previously borrowed money.
But normally your bank manager won't lend you that.
Absolutely. So that's why we moved to borrow from the sovereign bonds or issuing sovereign bonds, because that you can easily borrow, but you are borrowing not for the development of the people, but just to pay the interest rate of the money that you borrowed few years ago. So if you
So
understand,
it crashes somewhere. along the line.
absolutely. So that's called the debt snowballing, and that's why most of the people come and say, look, this government borrowed more money than the previous government. Of course it is, because your debt is, when you are borrowing more money to pay the interest rate, so that means you have to borrow for interest rate as well as to pay the principal amount. So that means your debt is every year snowballing, and that's what you see when you look at the debt numbers. In 2005 it was about 2 trillion, in 2020 it's about 4 trillion, and in 2020, after 10 years, it all of a sudden becomes 15 trillion. And now it's 17 trillion, and it's definitely more than that, and there are so many factors that affect
We
that.
can show you that the government debt. This is slide 2. The central government outstanding debt coming up on your screen about now. That's slide number 2. In the meantime, there you go, that's slide number 2. So in 2005, the government debt was 2,226.39 billion with a B. In 2010, it was 4,594.642 billion. And in 2020, amazingly, it went up to 15,117.247 billion. Now it is approximately 17 trillion and growing, because part of that 17 trillion was calculated when the dollar was at 202. Today, as we all know, ladies and gentlemen, the dollar is closer to 360 than it is to 202, meaning that it's gone through the roof. Dhananath, how, okay, that's government debt. What about this other debt then? The state-owned enterprises debt. Now that's a telling indictment on the state of affairs, isn't it? It's the next slide.
Yes, Faraz. So the state-owned enterprises is one of the main contributors for the government debt.
Right.
Because as I have spoken many more times before, we have about 527 state-owned enterprises. There are subsidiaries and sub-subsidiaries. And people have to understand this is not like this ministry, that ministry. This is the businesses that the government is engaged. It is not like the education ministry or the health ministry. These are the businesses where the government is entering, which the private sector could serve. So according to our records in 2020, we have about 2 trillion debt only from six state institutes, mainly the Petroleum Corporation, Electricity Board, Road Development Authority, Sri Lankan Airlines, Sri Lankan Ports Authority, and some others. So
3 others.
Yes, but those are very minimal.
Bigger ones.
Yes, the bigger ones are the Petroleum Corporation, Electricity Board, Road Development, and Sri Lankan Airlines.
But what is also telling is that the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, with its preliminary 2020 losses at 600 billion with a B, is actually 4% of GDP. That's an incredible amount of money for one state-owned enterprise. Not to be outdone is, of course, the Ceylon Electricity Board, with all their professionals and high salaries and great perks. 4.6% of GDP, or 690 billion. Come on, Dhananath, what on earth's happening? Is this a case for selling it off and getting the private sector in?
Yes, Faraz, I have been a promoter of privatization and restructuring the state-owned enterprises, because at this level of debt, you really can't move forward, because when you are spending 4.6% of your GDP only on debt on one state enterprises, your entire state sector becomes stagnant and you really can't move forward. So I think we also have to admit that the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation and Electricity Board, for their losses, the pricing has also contributed quite a lot, because they are importing at a very high rate and their selling price is...
But that's not a sustainable business
Absolutely,
model.
that's not a sustainable business. Same for electricity. But I think the way forward has to be, and there's no competition at the same time, because you are pretty much a monopoly, except for Petroleum Corporation, where you have the Lanka IOC, but it's only 2 players. So basically you are a monopoly or a duopoly, but still you are making losses. Ideally, when you are a monopoly, you should be making more money, but you are losing a lot of money. So I think first we have to bring competition, we have to unbundle those sectors, because on power there's generation, distribution, so we have to unbundle those two. Same for Petroleum Corporation, there's importation, there's storage, there's distribution. First we have to unbundle and bring competition into the system, so then we can somewhat bring the losses down. At the same time, I think the prices has to be revised, and when the prices are increased, of course the poor people will get affected. But the solution is not to bring down the prices overall. For that we have to support on a targeted mechanism. That's what we also proposed on our seven platform solutions. We have to provide a cash transfer system.
Now then, just ahead of the break, here's a bit of good news. Well, it's a silver clouding of sorts, okay? The price of a 12.5 kg domestic laugh gas cylinder has been reduced by 1,050 rupees with effect from today. Accordingly, the new price will be 5,800 rupees. That's good news. Let's put a smile on the people's faces, even if it's a tiny smile, right? Let's now listen to the headlines of the primetime news. We'll see you on the other side of the break. Thank you.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
What does China and India say about Dongman 5 in Sri Lanka? Provisional approval for Adani Group. When will Gotabaya return to Sri Lanka? Farmers demand reasonable price for paddy. Is Sri Lanka Railways in crisis? Why was Sri Lanka's acclaimed swimming champion at the CID?
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
And welcome back to Newsline Live. I'm in conversation with the Chief Operating Officer of the Advocata Institute, Mr. Dhananath Fernando. Mr. Fernando, thank you again for being here and telling us all about Sri Lanka's debt position, the real position, without any colouring of the figures or pulling the wool over anyone's eyes. So the next slide here is slide 3, is the private sector debt. And in absolute terms, in 2021, was what, $2,425 million?
Yes, so in 2021 the private sector, they have also borrowed in rupees as well as in dollars.
Right.
So they have borrowed about 426 million in rupees and about 2 billion in dollar terms. So that's because when we are calculating the debt for us, everyone focuses about the local or the government debt, but of course the private sector has also borrowed in dollar terms. For an example, our telecommunications industry, for their equipment, they have to borrow, they have to invest, they have to borrow from dollars and bring that equipment and then sustain the business. So at one point they have to pay that dollars, and they some of them may have earnings that will also be calculated in our national accounts, but they will also come to the local banks and say, look, give me dollars, I'll give you rupees to pay my creditors. So they also need dollars. So that has also to be calculated, and that's the challenge that we face with the debt restructuring, because private sector debt is also there, which hasn't considered in the process. So we are only considered that 51 billion US dollar debt, which is the external debt, and there are also debt, as we all know, the Sri Lanka development bonds, which is under the local regulation we have issued but a dollar debt, and at the same time, even in the public debt, Sri Lankan banks have lent a lot of money for the government in dollar terms.
Okay.
So even if it's the restructuring, there's an impact on the financial system. So it's very complicated, it's very technical, but the bottom line is that we all are going to get affected. It's not like because of the bank has debt that we are not going to affect, because when the banks feel the impact, that will impact all the businesses, micro and small medium businesses, and their employment and everyone.
And finally, finally for this part of it, the debt to GDP ratios, and I think it's coming on our screen now. In 2005, it was 91%, the debt to GDP ratio. In 2010, it was 72%, and in 2020, it was 101%. What does this indicate, Dhananath?
This indicates for us, so basically it's a small calculation where you have the debt as the numerator and the GDP, that means what as a country within that particular period, what we all produce.
Yeah.
So if you compare what we all produce with debt in 2020, actually our debt number is higher than our GDP. For a country in our scale or like emerging market, ideally it has to be under 70%. So we have gone for 100%, and the latest figures are about 120, 130 at the moment of the GDP.
Right.
So
we're spending that 20-30% more than actually we are earning.
Yes. So our debt to GDP ratio is increasing at a rapid rate because of course when the currency depreciates, it affects. At the same time, our interest payments are also mounting up, so that also adds on to this. So overall, our debt is not sustainable, and that's one of the main conditions of the IMF, that only there are two things that you can do, because you have the debt and the GDP. Either you have to reduce the debt, so that is why we are talking about a restructuring and asking people, look, we can't pay, cut our debt. And the other thing is you have to increase the GDP, because then your denominator increases, so then the ratio comes down. To do that, you have to grow the economy. To do that, people have to work hard. We have to produce more.
And we all need a bit more than 20 litres of petrol, my dear.
Absolutely. So that's where it's challenging. So we have to bring it down to a sustainable level, and we have to provide a plan for the IMF.
And that is the problem. Have you seen any documented plan from this government or any government? Have you seen this plan? Where on earth is the plan?
There's no plan for us. That's the worrying factor, because there are institutions and
they talk about things like policy this and policy that, and they talk about bridging finance, which is a temporary loan, isn't it?
Yes.
So before they can do that, you need a plan.
Absolutely, for us. So that's what we have all, I mean, if you recall, I mean, about 2-3 years ago, since then we have been asking, let's have a plan, let's do a plan. So we have proposed a plan. I think some other also political parties and other institutions have also proposed a plan, but government hasn't put anything forward. So as a result, I think even the IMF will consider what is the plan, because, and also people should know the plan, because then they can get prepared and the investors get prepared.
Your institute sent a thing to the president.
Yes, so we presented the state-owned enterprises reform report.
That one.
Yes, so it's a report that we have been doing since 2016. So this time we have calculated the return on assets, and we have ranked the key SOEs. But at the same time, we have proposed a 7-chapter plan on what reforms that we need to do. So that has been put forward, and we have contributed also our suggestions to the common minimum program, now which has become the discussion. But as you very correctly said, we really don't know the plan from the government.
So now then, the flip side of all this. When the dollar was 202, thereabouts, started the racket of people saying, you need to float this and bring it to real true levels. Okay, so they kind of devalued it and brought it. Today it's 360 or thereabouts, okay? Bread was 100 rupees back then when the dollar was 202. Today it's like 200. So isn't that a case of that the people can't afford to eat?
Definitely for us. People are having a very difficult time, and they have cut down. This happened in Lebanon as well, because their protein intake was cut down by about 50%. And that is happening in Sri Lanka as well, because when the protein, like fish and all the protein sources are...
So then another comparison. You know, they said we got to float it, market, blah blah blah. Fuel was 220, it's now 450 something.
Yes.
Right, and the quantities are limited. So, like we just said a few seconds ago, there may be hardly a queue, but the fact is that we've only got perhaps about 50% of what we really need. Right? And just because we are all running around with our 20 litres, commerce is affected, isn't it? The economy is affected. You've just said we need to grow the economy. How can you grow it when it's like holding back somebody Hussein Bolt's trying to run and you're holding on to one of his legs.
Yes, Farah. So on the rupee depreciation, if you recall, during that period, we really didn't have dollars to import anything, and there was at 200 rupees, no one really could get about $100, even someone going overseas. So that was the context. So at that point for us, there was no other option, because you really didn't have any dollars in the system. But what we did was, actually, though we said that we floated the rupee, actually we didn't do it in the right way. Because when this was done by, if I recall right, the then governor A.S. Jayawardena, so there is a process that how you do it, because you first speak to the IMF, because then you know there's some stability coming in. So what he had done was, he had spoken to the IMF, and then he had increased the interest rates first, and then you do a statement that we are floating the dollar, and with that the IMF follows up with a statement, okay, we welcome the decision, and in case of if of a requirement, IMF is ready to support. So then it floats and it stabilizes at one point. But this time we did it completely the other way around. Even the finance minister, Ali Sabri, the then finance minister, he said he also got to know the floating on the.
Isn't that illegal though?
That I don't know, for us, to be honest, whether it's legal or illegal. But
I mean, it's who?
I think the
who
governor.
gave them permission?
No, I think the governor can make the decision, because I was told even during that A.S. Jayawardena's time, the Professor G.L. Piris was the Deputy Finance Minister. So he was also informed about like 20 to half an hour before floating the currency then. So I'm not sure the legality about it, but I can say the floating process was slightly, we followed a different process, because
so how yes, I got it, but how do you drive the fuel price down?
Fuel price down for us, there is, when your rupee is depreciated, you really can't bring it down. So basically you have to, ideally you have to keep the market prices, and then you have to provide a cash transfer for people who are most vulnerable with higher fuel usage, because by bringing down the fuel prices, you're running to the same problem of CPC losing money. Because
so basically, at the end of the day, Dhananath, you know, there's no other way to say it, but other than to say the people are suffering, right? The public transportation costs have also gone up because the diesel costs have gone up. Medicines are hardly there, so people will eventually start dying for the. I'm not being dramatic, but it's true though. You know, if I don't take my Tika tablets, and you know, Prakash will have a fit, but I'll probably pop off then, because if I don't have those tablets, right? So, and this is just not me. There's loads of people. I met a couple many years ago, just outside Ampari in Kalawan Chikodi, and that couple told me that they needed 2 glucophage tablets, 2 in the morning, 2 in the evening, each of them. So there's 4 and 4, 8 tablets. But collectively, between the two, the husband and wife, they could only afford 1 tablet each. You know, so 50%. So what's the point? And so that was several years ago, and today we're facing the same kind of problem. So people will die, people are hungry. What is the solution?
For us, solution is we have to restructure the economy. We have to allow the prices to work, and we have to first, it's a very complicated solution. So first we have to start with reforming some of the loss-making state-owned enterprises, because we have to save money. As I said, we have to bring down the debt down and increase the growth.
Also, should we, because we're about to finish, should we, you know, the people, the nobility, the people with money, let's call them the nobility, should they be cutting down on their expenditure and helping with the difference, helping the people who are not so well off?
Absolutely, for us. So that can be done in 2 ways. Of course, you know, you can help more people, but of course through the taxation, because we have given so many tax holidays for people, and we have given a massive tax break.
Has anyone, in your opinion or in your information, has any of these corporates or the higher taxpayers, have they voluntarily gone to the Inland Revenue Department and said, you know what, I don't want this tax cut, so we're going to pay you at the old rate? Has anyone done that?
According to my knowledge, no, for us. But I think there's
should we welcome such a thing?
That we should welcome, but I think the corporate sector was willing to pay taxes, because
nobody actually asked for this.
Exactly, because for them it's unfair, because if you recall the last budget, there was they were asked to pay about a 1 billion tax if they had made a certain threshold of profit. So that is very difficult for them to manage, rather than it's easier for them to pay the taxes on a regular basis, because you pay the taxes once you have a profit and an income.
Dhananath Fernando, thank you very much. We've run out of time, but ladies and gentlemen, we leave you. The take home this evening is that Dhananath Fernando, from the COO from the Advocaat Institute, has just confirmed that we have a combined debt of 17 trillion rupees, 17 trillion. And that's the way it was tonight on Newsline Live. Take care. It's now time for the primetime news. And as always, God bless you all.